Welcome to this series on legends in the field of parks and recreation, sponsored by the American Academy for Park and Recreation Administration. My name is Jim Bradamus. I'm on the faculty in the Department of Leisure Studies at the University of Illinois in Urbana-Champaign. I'm particularly pleased today to be talking with Dr. Joseph Bannon, a friend and colleague who has served on the faculty in the Department of Leisure Studies at the University of Illinois for the last 24 years. For 15 of those years, he was the head of the department. Recently retired, he still serves as professor emeritus and remains active in teaching and in state, national, and international affairs in the field. He also remains very active on the golf course. Joe, I have a few questions for you and would appreciate your comments on several issues. Let's start from the beginning of your career by asking how you first became involved in the field of parks and recreation.
You're asking me to think way back. I'll try to do that. It's about almost 35 years ago or more when I got out of the Army. I decided, what am I going to do with my life? And I attended Ithaca College in Ithaca, New York, where I pursued a degree in physical education. And while I was pursuing that degree, I worked in a neighborhood community house on the north side of Ithaca, which was a rather poor, disadvantaged section of the community, where I engaged in providing recreation activities for people of that particular neighborhood. Towards my senior year, it came time for me to do my field work in physical education. And I was assigned a small high school where junior high school and high school, where I had the opportunity to teach physical education to 7th and 8th graders and to coach the 8th grade basketball team. That was a very helpful experience for me, because when I completed it, I knew exactly what I did not want to do.
You did not want to stay in physical education.
I did not want to stay into physical education and teach physical education. So as I proceeded through my senior year, and my wife kept saying to me, are we going to look for a job? I said, maybe we will go to graduate school. And so with that, I applied to a number of graduate schools, one of which being the University of Illinois, back in 1957, and was awarded an assistantship and came to the University of Illinois, where I began, I would say, my career in parks, recreation, leisure, a field that at that particular time was little known to me. What people did as far as working in that area was little known to me. So it's kind of like a happenstance kind of thing.
Now, did you stay at the University of Illinois all those, I mean, after you graduated, what?
I graduated with a master's degree from the University of Illinois in '58 and left and went to New Jersey as a director of Parks and Recreation in a little small community outside of New York City, and then stayed there about 5 years and left and became the general superintendent of recreation in Topeka, Kansas, and returned to the University of Illinois in 1966, where I became the chief of field service, which some people might recognize, the Office of Recreation and Park Resources.
Which, by the way, is now called the Office of Recreation and
Yes.
Tourism Development.
This was primarily a job where I had the opportunity to travel around the state, work with local park districts, help areas begin park districts, and consult with them on a variety of things. And at that time, I also did some teaching in the program.
But you were working on a PhD at that time?
No, I was not working on a PhD. I didn't start working on a PhD until 1969. And then I completed that PhD in 1972.
And then you stayed?
Then I stayed. I returned to the Office of Recreation and Park Resources. And then in 1973, I became the head of the Department of Leisure Studies.
Okay, thank you. Now, I know there were several people throughout your professional career to whom you looked for guidance and advice. Tell me, who were your mentors in this field?
I think I was fairly lucky person in my professional career because I had the exposure of, I think, some very outstanding individuals that made tremendous impression upon my life. I would say that there's two people that influenced me greatly, and one that I would put in that category of mentor or mentorship to me. When I left the University of Illinois in 1958 and became the Director of Recreation and Parks in Leonia, New Jersey, I became acquainted with a person by the name of George Butler.
Very famous name.
George Butler,
Right.
who wrote one of the first textbooks in recreation and was really a pioneer in our field, is recognized that way in numerous books and writings of people who have made major contributions. He was chairman of my board, so it was like going to school every board meeting. He was the chair for 5 years. He helped me a great deal. He had a tremendous amount of influence on me. At that particular time, he was the Director of Research for the National Recreation Association, which was in New York.
Which was the predecessor for the National Recreation and Parks Association.
And the ARS and other joining organizations. And he had a tremendous influence on me. George Butler was one of the first individuals who really began to do what I would call survey kind of research, which was data collection, descriptive kind of study. He did a number of comprehensive plans throughout the country in major metropolitan areas. He was an individual that was an instructor and a pioneer in the old NRA recreation school. He goes back to the 1930s. He has a tremendous wealth of knowledge and wealth of history.
He was way ahead of his time.
Oh, no question. He spent 41 years with the National Recreation Association, died at about 92, and 6 months before his death, he was still pretty active and very alert, and revised his book, The Introduction to Community Recreation, for the 5th time when he was 84. So you can see he was an individual that had a great deal of knowledge, and I learned a great deal from him. The other person who had a lot of influence on my life, though had not been involved in my life in this field for any stretch of time, was, of course, Charles Brightbill, the former head of the Department of Recreation and Park Administration and Leisure Studies at the University of Illinois. I look at, differently from George Butler, I look at Charles Brightbill being the one of our first philosophers, one of the first to put on paper, one of the first to begin to theorize what this business is all about. As I look at the journals today, a lot of the experiments, a lot of studies that are going on reflect a great many of the philosophies that he espoused during those 1940s and the 1950s. He was an individual that was very active in the Truman administration as it relates to recreation for the armed forces, for USO and organizations of that nature. And he was an outstanding individual. And he taught 2 courses that I took. He taught the course Recreation and Park Administration 402, which now I teach here.
Right.
And he also taught the Foundations course. A very stimulating instructor, can leave a very great impression upon you, and one who made a great deal, had a great deal of influence on me in terms of some of my own thought and ideas and theory. The person who I probably would consider mentor in the strictest sense of the word mentor, and I still look at him almost that way, is, of course, Al Sapora, who is a former head of the Department of Leisure Studies and dean of the college where the department is housed, was my advisor. He was my mentor. He has helped me with my master's thesis. He was the chair of my dissertation. He also has become a great friend. He has given me guidance. He's given me opportunity. He's always one that I've been able to go to and lay out a problem and expect in return from him a very honest, open answer, not one that I particularly would want to hear sometimes. But he has been a tremendous influence upon me, not only as a thinker, but as a practitioner, as one who writes to some degree. He's given me those opportunities that I never would have gotten if I hadn't had the association with Al Sapora. So I would, if I've made any contribution to this field, then I think it's as a result of people like Doc Sapora, who not only mentored me, but literally thousands of young people around the country today.
Right, and Al Sapora is still here and still offering us
very
advice
active,
when we
and as a matter
when
of
we need
fact, when I came here as a young student in 1958, never did I dream that I would be sharing a cubbyhole office with him as I'm doing today,
Right.
as he's a professor emeritus and I'm a professor
Right.
emeritus.
Still a very strong individual, and we're always delighted to see Al when he comes into the office. Well, I must say you had some impressive mentors in your career, and it's very safe for me to say that you have been a mentor to a very, very large number of students who have come through the University of Illinois and who have done very well in their careers and who are doing very well now. Well, one of your strong areas of interest has been administration. And there are many abilities, attitudes, and skills that go into the making of a quality park and recreation administrator. What are some of these attributes, and which do you feel are the most important?
Well, I think as you've mentioned, Jim, my area of involvement throughout my career has been in management and administration of leisure services. There's no question. That's been my role, and I recognize that. Having been, head of the department here, and also been an administrator throughout as a practitioner. Management and leadership have been something that has intrigued me a tremendous amount as I've gone through the last 30 years. It's something that I've watched for. I'm very careful about trying to identify certain traits that will predict leadership. I don't think that's a very good idea because I've seen many people with traits that have been outstanding but have not been particularly successful. However, several years ago, I did take the opportunity to take a sabbatical from the University of Illinois. And that sabbatical took me in travels to the Far East, in China, Korea, Japan, Okinawa, and I had the opportunity there, particularly in Japan, to visit with upper-level management people in organizations like Panasonic Corporation, Japan Airlines, Nippon Steel. And then another part of my sabbatical, I had the opportunity to have very direct contact and personal interviews with upper management in some very large corporations in the United States, like Texas Instrument, Xerox, 3M, TWA, Eastman Kodak, and organizations of that nature. And one of the things that I did during that study was to look at health and wellness in these corporations. But the other thing that I did was to take a look at, what are some of these attributes, I guess you might call them, that I saw displayed in these people who that were, I suppose, because of the position they're in and getting to that level, would be by some criteria being successful. And I monitored that. I took very meticulous notes throughout all of this period of a year. And to boil it down to what I'm going to tell you, I came up with about 7 things that I noticed these individuals had that were consistent among all of these people. I certainly don't want to imply that if you have these characteristics that you will be successful. The only thing I'm saying is that these people who seemingly were successful in the organization seem to display these characteristics. And so I will just give you what they are. By the way, there were about 50 different characteristics. However, I selected what I would call the 7. I guess I would qualify this. This was all private enterprise. This was not the public sector. However, I would say that there's a transition here, certainly, between the public and private sector as it relates to leadership and management skills and so forth. The first thing I noticed that every one of these individuals had an incredible amount of energy. They're energy-oriented. They were dynamic. They were active. They were current. They were. Sometimes I almost, as I talked with them, felt that they were maybe 2 minutes ahead of me in terms of what I'm doing. And I that vibrated back to me. There's this whole aspect of energy and the dynamic of the individual. The other thing that I noticed, these were people that just conveyed, the moment you met them, an aura of self-confidence, that they could do it type of attitude. They were people who knew their limitations, but when you spoke to them about their enterprises or their goals for the organization, they did this in a display of enormous confidence and stature, almost, that you believed them. And as I talked around the various companies, I also found that other people felt that way too. Another characteristic I found, that these people were good at something. They picked out a particular skill, and they were very, very good at it. And they were very good at it because they spent time and practice and read and learned and got experience in a particular area. I guess you might call it skill mastery. They weren't super great in everything, but they did have a thing. It might have been communication. It might be oral presentation, or it might be in writing skill. But when you talk to colleagues of theirs, they would tell you about this particular skill. And I thought that was kind of interesting, that this was something that displayed across the board to all these people.
Something stood out.
There was no question. This, like I say, it might have been a particular skill of communication or negotiation or decision-making or very decisive, but they mastered that particular skill. And this, by the way, I believe strongly in, is that every single one of these people were not detail people. They were vision people. They left the detail to somebody else. They were excellent delegators. These were people who were able to set goals, establish objectives, bring in a team who would identify tasks in different activity to meet the goals, and then they would step back and monitor. They were the ones that if you wanted to ask what the organization was going to be like in the year 2000, they were the ones that were prepared to articulate that, and they could see that. Whereas I went lower management, and I guess this is appropriate. Lower management, they were more concerned about what tomorrow. Right. And these were people that I felt that were very much in tune with that, the long range of an organization. Another characteristic was personal commitment. They were really committed, and I think that's so important in our field, particularly in some of our social service fields, that if you're not committed to the product, to the service, or to whatever it is, then I'm not so sure that you can employ some of these other characteristics. If you're going to have energy for something, then you got to have commitment to it.
Or to get others to follow you.
If you're going to get people to
committed.
Get that vibration that you have, then you've got to demonstrate that you're 100% behind that whole commitment also. Another characteristic I found this particularly in the Panasonic Corporation, which was a corporation of employees of worldwide. Panasonic, which is in Japan is known as National Corporation, is a corporation of about 160,000 employees around the world, all over the world. But these individuals had a concern for people. They didn't see the organization as a piece of machine. They didn't see it as a machinery or cogs in the wheel. They saw people as human beings. They saw a concern for these people in terms of their own personal welfare. They saw a sensitivity, and you can see that through some of the programs that were offered in many of these organizations, particularly as I was studying the health and wellness
For
program.
employees.
For employees, that they were, when I first went into it, I thought, well, these employee programs and fitness programs are programs that are going to, reduce absenteeism and improve productivity,
Right.
and they do.
Right.
But I didn't get the feeling that that was the only reason. I thought there was a genuine interest on the part of many of these corporations that I talked to and executives that this was good for the employees. And then the last characteristic, that every one of these people were concerned about fitness. I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah.
It's kind of an interest of my own,
Mm-hmm.
but as I reflected back on it, I thought to myself, that makes sense, because one of the things that characteristics they all displayed was energy and commitment, and if you're going to do that, you're not going to be a person that can do that very well if you're not at some level of
Right.
fitness. I'm not saying everybody has to run marathons, but I am saying that these people put in their day a certain amount of time that was relegated to taking care of my body, my person. And they wouldn't let that be interrupted. If meetings were going to be held, the meetings weren't going to be held. Secretaries that to these individuals knew that those were times that were not. And if you could go into some of these corporations and see the facilities that they had, particularly in Japan, you would see that they did make not only personal commitments in terms of themselves, but they believed in it because they put a large number of dollars.
Yeah, I'm not sure that we've bought into that quite as
There's no question.
quite to that
We have
extent
not.
that Japan
No.
has. But it appears that fitness translates into energy, which translates into charisma, which translates into self-confidence, all of which goes into making a better manager.
So when I say to you I was surprised, I guess I was. Initially I was surprised to see physical fitness, but yet when you look at those other things that seem to gel, is in terms of kind of the characteristics of this, the individual, that it makes sense, because you can't have all these others if you're not somewhat fit.
Right. Now, speaking of fitness and marathons, what is your running schedule these days? It used to be 10, 12 miles a day. Now that you're a professor emeritus, what is your running schedule now?
Well, I think Professor Emeritus in some way implies you're retired.
You're over the hill.
And yeah.
No, but what,
But
you're still
I
running.
still run 4 to 5 miles a day, 4 to 5 days a week.
That's very good, Joseph. Very, very good. Well, I have another question for you. In general, how do you feel about the park and recreation profession currently, and what do you see as some of the important issues in the next decade?
This is a very difficult question to be answered 2 weeks after a major shift in administrations. And so
In the national
on the national agenda,
Right.
yeah, the national scene. And I think that that's not a question that if you asked me 3 months ago, the answer that I would give you today, I'm not so sure would be exactly the same.
Why do you say that?
Well, because I say that because I think there's some shifting. I'm not trying to predict. I'm just giving you a kind of a personal impression that one of the shifts that we have got going on, we've had an era for the last 16 years, and somewhat prior to that, even with Democratic administrations, where we've had to deal with national issues that have required expenses on a national basis to look to defending our country.
The military.
Billions and
Defense,
billions in
right.
defense. And I would say that that's true also in many cases in the Kennedy administration, the Johnson administration, and the administrations all the way through. And it seems now we're moving into a new era with the younger people who are now getting into the administration, with people like President-elect Clinton and Gore, because we're no longer worried about the Soviet Union, because there isn't any. We don't really, and they don't have the money, Russia, to prepare themselves in nuclear weapons
Right.
and et cetera. So we don't have the tensions that we have as it relates to with Germany, East and West, and the wall, and the things that everyone has read about during the past week. So I suspect that there's a very good chance that the shift is going to be from a defense-oriented kind of large expenditures and defense-oriented kinds of things to a more concern for domestic policy. And as a result of that shift, I see parks and recreation and leisure possibly benefiting from that, because I see us as a social service. I see us as it relates to the quality of life. I see this as taking care, a more caring type of policy that might emanate from this new administration.
Well, what do you see as the future of parks and recreation in the cities and towns and boroughs and villages of America? Do you see it being better financed now? Do you see some possibilities of some upsurges in interest in our field? Or, there are budget problems and taxing problems and all over the country. But what do you see of the future in our towns for parks and recreation?
Well, I don't know whether I want to discuss it in the context of future. What I think I would rather discuss it on the basis of issues during this decade of the 1990s as we move into the 21st century. Some things that, and certainly some of the things I'm saying is not exclusive of any of the others, many, but I think that there's going to be some issues that we're not going to have to deal with, not only at the national level, but I think at the state level, and most particularly at the local level. One certainly is that we are still, and I think going to continue through the decade of the 90s, in what I would call a financial conservatism. We're going to find a shift, it seems to me, from where particularly local park and recreation services are going to be, the question of funding is going to come up. And I think people in management and administration are going to have to be much more entrepreneurial. And I think there's going to be a philosophical issue here that what is the major role of a community in providing local park and recreation services? As I do studies around the country and talk with park boards and recreation agencies, I will tell you that directors are required to generate, in many cases, much more than 50% of what they do, which gives it a totally different kind of administrative style and a different philosophy. Another issue that I think that's one that it's simply not a simple issue, it's a difficult one, that the only way it'll be resolved is through a compromise, and that is the issue of environments and jobs. Now, there's no one side of that issue. We must maintain a high-level environment for future generations. There's no question about that. But the question is, and I wish I had an answer, a nice clean answer, is how do you balance that so that you don't have unemployment rates that have all kinds of filtering down to how people buy, how much people are going to participate in recreation.
Timber industry is one.
Is a good one. Are you going to have owls? Are you going to have marshlands?
Right.
Are you going to have highways? Are you going to have shopping centers? How do you balance this? And I think that right now, that what troubles me, it is a dichotomous almost issue in that people are so far either to the right or to the left on that, it seems that it's very difficult to bring people together to bring that balance. And as long as people are not willing to bring balance to that, I don't think that problem is going to be solved.
Well, if you could speak to a group of students today who might be interested in a career in the field of parks and recreation, what advice would you give those fledgling students?
When I knew you were going to ask me that question, and so right now working for me, I have a student from the Department of Leisure Studies. And so I called her in, and I said to her, what would you like to have me tell you? And so I got her perspective, plus I got a couple of my own. Hers, you'll find, her perspective deals more with what the job market's going to be. Mine are not, though I think that's very important. If I were to advise a person who's made a commitment to the field, who has said that they want to dedicate their professional life to serving others in the area of parks and recreation, I would say to them that as a student, every chance you get, paid or non-paid, get some experience.
Right, I would agree.
Get some experience. I don't care if it's working in a church basement with preschoolers, or whether it's working with senior citizens at the local senior center. Become a volunteer if you have to. You must get that experience. You must get that exposure. If you do, you may end up like I did as a young student in college who found out teaching is not for me. I don't want to coach seventh grade basketball. And so I think that, that's one area. Once the person has entered into the field, then I think it's an absolute must that they continue with continuing education.
Right.
There's an information turnover about every 7 years, which means that if I'm 19 years old and I enter college and I graduate, that it means by the time I'm 26, what I've learned could be obsolete. And quite frankly, I would say that right now parks and recreation do not do enough of that, though many states are making very earnest attempts in bringing about through continuing education units.
Through their state park and recreation association and through the National Recreation and Parks Association.
They do a good job.
Right.
Where I think we could do a better job is at the university level. I think that we should never allow a student to leave a university and let them think that their education is through. That's why we call it commencement. Commencement, it begins. Right. And so this is something where I think that we need to work very hard on, and something that I would advise them. Another area would be if you're going to become a professional, then a true professional is not one that goes to work at 8 o'clock in the morning and finishes the job at 8 to 10 o'clock at night. That's the person that extends themselves beyond the job. They must become involved in professional activities through their local organizations, through their state organizations, through their national organizations, because if we are going to maintain a high level, then we're only going to do that through the young people that are coming into the profession. And again, I think we need to do more in our universities to impress upon the people that organizations exist today because people have taken on major responsibilities of being on committees and on boards and in presidents and secretaries and so forth to keep these organizations viable. And I don't think we can always ask, what do I get? It's, I guess, a question of what are you giving to the organization as much as what you're going to get from it. And I would really impress upon them the serious importance of doing that, particularly as a young person in the field.
But would you agree there is a future out there for
No, I think it's bright.
our students?
Let me address that. I think it's very bright. I think there's going to be some tough times during the 1990s as it relates to financing. But I think overall it's bright. Why do I think it's bright? I think it's bright because I'm going to predict here, I suspect for the next 8 years we will probably have whatever administration in there at the federal level that will be more concerned about human issues, of which I see as parks and recreation. And as a result of that, I think that that's going to bring the level and concern of local communities and local municipalities and states for park and recreation. I think that they're going to be more concerned about that. And I think that that's going to develop and permeate through, as a result of our federal administration, but it'll permeate down into local administrations. So I think that just from a philosophical point of view, it's bright. Now from a very practical and economic. Let's face it, today, even in these tough times, Americans are spending $300 billion a year for parks and recreation. Now I don't think that's going to go down. I think that's going to go up. Inflation included, I think that could very easily, by the end of this decade, go to $500 billion to $600 billion for parks and recreation.
Big business.
Big business. So I see leisure and recreation not only contributing to the human aspect of an individual's life, but I also see it contributing to an economic.
Oh, absolutely.
And so I think that we're beginning to get that message across. You can see that with the number of states that are forming more active tourism bureaus, appointing people in those positions. You can even see it at the local level where you get convention and visitor bureaus are becoming much more active than they are. So I would say, yeah, it's going to be tough for the next 4 or 5 years. Jobs are going to be tight. But I see over the long haul, we're in a cycle. And I think that we're going to come out of this cycle because the demand for parks and recreation are going to be really great. And I think the other thing I'm finding, too, in doing a lot of the surveys, that people are willing to pay for this kind of activity. So I see just yesterday, for example, I was involved in a study this past spring in Charleston, South Carolina. And they used the need assessment study that we did down there to float a $34 million bond issue, which passed and was the only bond issue of which there were 4 that passed in Charleston, South Carolina, that has gone through Hugo and gone through devastation, the pressed area where jobs and tourism jobs are down, tourism is one of their major industries,
right.
And they were able to pass a $34 million bond issue. That was very positive, I thought.
So there's some real optimism.
I think so.
Right. Well, finally, let me ask you, of all of your many professional accomplishments, and there are many, what stands out most in your mind?
Well, I would like to leave that question to others, quite frankly.
Well, I would appreciate a few comments. At least, I mean, there are a number of significant contributions that you've made to the field, and surely there are a few that you feel very, very good about. What might be a few of those?
Well, one of them would be certainly the opportunity that I had to be the head of the Department of Leisure Studies for 15 years. And that really was an opportunity that was given to me. Because during that 15 years, we had the opportunity to acquire an incredible staff at the University of Illinois, people that have distinguished themselves far greater than I have in terms of their contribution. And I feel that if I were able to have played a role in setting the stage or facilitating some of these people that who've distinguished themselves and who have contributed greatly, then I feel very good about that. I also feel good at the fact that I was given a department that was certainly in very great shape, but for 15 years that I was head of the department, there was no survey that ever was done where we weren't ranked either 1 or 2 in the nation. And not only that, but we've had some of our graduates, not only in academe, but in practice, have been, really dynamic individuals in our fields who, I suppose, will be legends in their own right when they get old enough. So that I guess that's probably the greatest one. The other is that now that I'm retired from the University of Illinois, I'm staying active. And one of the areas I'm staying active in is in the publishing business. And I feel good about that because here, through that business, we're able to give many of the young people today the opportunity to publish materials, to present their thoughts and their ideas and get it into the literature. We're the main publisher of the journal Park and Recreation Administration, which is now in its about 10th year. I feel good about that because if we didn't have that journal, there wouldn't be a place for many of our young people to go to. So these are things that I've had the opportunity to become involved in, and I suppose in the future someone will judge whether or not these are major contributions.
Good. Well, thank you, Joe, for sharing your thoughts with us today. You've made really some great contributions to our field, and we do wish you well in the future. If anyone out there needs a golf partner, call Joe. He's ready to play anytime. And we thank you for listening to Dr. Joseph Bannon from the University of Illinois.